Welcome to part two of the Nora Burns interview. As a reminder, Nora is an expert in human resources, not just because of the roles she's held, but because of the hundreds of undercover interviews she's been on in order to truly research what is happening in the hiring processes today. In part one of her interview, in the last episode, we discussed what we as women can do ourselves to increase our chances of getting the interviews and receiving the offers in male-dominated companies. In this episode, part two, we're going to focus on what companies can do to equalize the interview and hiring process so that they can truly recruit more women into their organizations. Take a listen. Okay, so we are getting back in with Nora Burns. You guys hopefully heard part one where we talked about equalizing the hiring process in the construction industry, in male-dominated industries, and we really focused on, for some reason in that episode, I was calling it a tunnel, that women, what we can do to jump the biases and to get into the interview and get the job and get the offer letter, all of that stuff. Today, what we're going to focus on is the other side of the table. What are the things that companies you're finding, Nora, that companies are doing that are probably hurting their ability to attract the right candidates and to get them to accept the offer letter? They may have loved the employee, but the employee left the interview thinking, "No way, I'm working here." What do you got for us?
Oh my gosh. So many things come to mind. So one of the things, how we're getting in our own way as employers is by how we're putting the job posting out into the world. There's a difference between a job description and a job posting, but most of us aren't appreciating that. So we're just putting the job description out into the universe saying, if you meet all of these criteria, we want to talk to you. And that I'm an HR geek and I don't want to read your job descriptions. I just don't. And so how do we position it in a way that really brings our personality as an organization forward and make sure that we're not only telling them what we need, but what we offer, right? It's an employment relationship. So we need to make sure we're honoring both sides of that in how we're posting our jobs, how we're putting them out in the world. I see it time and time again on LinkedIn where somebody will share like a job post and be like, "Hey, we're hiring." And then they'll write something that has such a strong bias in it. They're hiring, guys for our team. We're hiring, a crewman for our team, right? And it's just because they're employees that are trying to help spread the word, but we haven't prepped them accordingly in order to do that.
That's
and
fair.
Then when you read those things, you think they're really not looking for me. They're really not looking for me. We know from study after study that when we put lots of wish list items into our job postings and into our job descriptions, that we start eliminating women from that funnel. Women will want to make sure that they check every box. And if it says you need 6 years of experience and they have 5 years of experience, all too often they will not put their name in the hat. Meanwhile, sorry guys, but it's just what the studies have shown us. A guy with 3 years of experience is going to put his name in the hat. And then somewhere in there, somebody's going to say, "Oh, he only has the 3 years, but look, he has this experience over here." Meanwhile, we're not even talking to the women with 3 years experience because we set the bar higher than that. And so we're getting in our own way with that. We're also getting in our way with some of the language that we use in our job posts. Whenever we talk about a competitive workplace environment, we have a stronger draw towards men. When we talk about a collaborative workplace environment, we have a stronger tie towards women. So there are words that tend to draw one versus the other. And so it's just really important to have a blend of the language that we're using to make sure we're not ruling people out. But the biggest way in all of that is a wish list that is really not key to the job. It'd be really great if they had experience with this one very specific form of software, except it's something we can train somebody on, and it's not going to be an essential function of their job. And now we've just ruled out a whole lot of people, mostly women. I'm not saying you can't talk about it, the wish list items, once you get into the interview. I just want as many people in the funnel as possible. So I want to broaden the initial funnel of getting as many candidates in as possible at the very start of the process, because that's where women will remove themselves from the process, right?
Yes.
Once we can start talking about it in the interview, great, bring it up in the interview. on-site interview, not the phone interview, women will still exit from that process. So I think the more we can do that and write really interesting and truthful, we so misrepresent jobs in the interviewing process. And then somebody shows up on the first day and 3 weeks in, they realize this is not the job they signed up for because we didn't give them a realistic job preview. Because that means looking beyond what the paper job description says and really what is it that this person does on a day-to-day basis. And to do that really well, you should be talking to the people who are currently in the job. And do they agree that this is a description of what that is? They're going to give you so much great information about what they really deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I love that. In terms of kind of sorting, we get in our own way that way.
Yeah.
I'm a huge advocate of blind applications. What the heck do I mean by that? I mean, blind resumes.
I am aware. I agree 100%. Blind applications would get so many more women and minorities into interviews. 100% agree.
Yeah. So for those of you who are listening and are wondering what we are talking about, what I recommend for my clients and what we've done in the past is that if you're looking at paper resumes or paper applications, you redact anything that is identifiable as potential gender specific, economic specific, right? Like addresses and types of things like that you don't need to know. You don't need to know what year somebody graduated high school. Could we please stop asking them in the interview, in the application stage, what year they graduated high school? Any of that information gets redacted. And we only get to the core element of what that application is, because then you're making a decision based on their real experience and their real background, and you're not distracted in any way by the fact that this is Jan versus Jim or, along the way. I think in some areas of the country, by the way, when I did the undercover candidate, Atlanta, I don't know what is going on with you, but until I changed those applications to having a 404 area code, I could not get an interview in Atlanta for whatever I did. And again, as the undercover candidate, I could put anything on the application. Kind of not held to my own background, but they wanted people who were already in Atlanta consistently. So, but doing things like that where we're
about that for a second.
Yeah.
So I have had the same phone number since I got my first bag phone in
oh my gosh,
right, like 1990 or whatever. I've had the same phone number, and I have lived in Missouri, Iowa, Tennessee, Texas, and then 2 cities in Texas, 2 cities in Missouri. And my area code's always been the same. So that's really interesting that they're not even processing that with today's world, it could be any area code.
Yeah, but let me also tell you this. Speaking of area codes, it's not unlike when we had to stop asking people their social security numbers, which PS stop asking people their social security numbers. You can tell by reading a social security number, if you understand how the code works, where somebody was born and about when they were born. You can tell what part of the country they were born, right? Because it's a code. It's a code. Now, the thing with cell phone numbers is that now we are sticking with wherever we got our cell phone number when we first got our cell phone, right? Mm-hmm. So I happen to get my staying cell phone. I did change it when I moved from Wisconsin to Colorado. But if you know what that area code is, you also tell a story about what people are like from there, right? What people from that came out backwards. You tell a story about the area code based on what that person is like based on where they lived when they were a kid and they got their cell phone, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the story you tell about my having a rural Wisconsin's area code versus my having a rural Alabama area code versus my having a Chicago area code are different. And so as time goes on, it becomes an important element to start removing from our processes for blind resumes, because we tell a story. And anytime you tell a story, bias is baked in.
Well, and it could also be like, say I'm in Texas and somebody walks in with an 816 area code. I'm like, oh my gosh, we have something in common. And so now I've told myself a story that makes me feel like this may be a better candidate than they actually are because I have a connection with them. Okay.
You have a connection.
Yeah. let's move into the interview, the actual interview process. So what's interesting to me is the last company I worked for, they would set it up so it was teams. There were multiple of us that would interview a person at the same time.
Mhm.
And I really liked the process because we each kind of would come up with different things that we would ask. But and we would play off of each other. But what was interesting, there was one other manager and myself that we seemed to always get in interviews together. And at the end, we would just do this quick thumbs up or thumbs down after the candidate left the building, right? Like not in front of them, but just to see like what is our initial take. And I swear to you, 7 times out of 10, we were complete opposites. Like we were seeing completely different things in the same interview.
Mhm.
So I I'm really excited to hear what your take is on what people really should and should not be paying attention to.
Uh, yes, and we could do a 3-hour workshop on this, and I do.
Yes, we don't have 3 hours, so why
Let's
don't
do
we
the
why don't
Cliff Notes
we do
version.
top three? Let's pick
Top
the top three
top
things.
three. Now, I want to talk about a couple things. One, I do love team interviews. I'm a huge advocate for team interviews, as long as we're preparing the team members on understanding what the legal roles are. Right? Please don't write down 5'2" blonde right on your notes.
Right.
That's not good. So, so as long as we're doing preparations for that, I also, when you're doing team interviews, I want a rubric. I want to set up that we're evaluating core competencies for that job. We are evaluating each one, and I want likability to be one of those elements. Because if you make likability one of the elements, you start to strip the bias away from why we gave that same candidate high scores on other elements,
Oh, that's
right?
interesting.
So I know the person is likable, and so I liked their story, or they're a very good storyteller, kind of a thing. So if you put likability on, it helps to strip out some of the bias. The other is I want you each to individually rate those before you say thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yep.
Or this is what I want you to use math. I love me a spreadsheet. And so this also does it, because then it's not only on how did I feel about the person, but the very real reality of how they answered technical questions or how they answered questions about how they work with others. I want us to please only ask about conflict once per interviewing. One of the biggest mistakes I saw candidates or employers make is to ask questions about conflict 2, 3, and 4 times in an interview.
That would make
I,
me feel like there's going to be a lot of conflict in this company. They're preparing me.
they're preparing me. I'm like, one question about conflict. If there is conflict that you have to deal with, or you want to see how people navigate it, okay. To ask it multiple times sends your best candidates packing, because they
Absolutely.
don't want anything to do with that organization. But I also like that you're focused on really what is the really core elements of the job. All too often we get distracted by things that are not all that important to the role. And so we ask them about computer skills or something, and we have a very basic tablet that we use. They don't have to know Word, they don't have to know Excel, they don't have to know how to do a pivot table, right? They have to use basic electronics, the same types of things they use if they use a smartphone and they use apps on it. They don't need to have high level computer skills, and yet we tell in our own minds that they do. And then the candidate that has worked on all of these different types of software, we suddenly overrank, even though it has nothing to do with the job. So we have to really focus on what is the key element for that particular job. We talked about this previously with the handshake. Unless you're an outside salesperson, a handshake is simply not an important element of most jobs. If you're an accountant, I really don't care what your handshake is like. Can you do the math? Can you do the math? And can you work it? And so making sure that what we're asking about is relevant to the job. The other big mistake that organizations I've seen make is that they're asking people to do work, real work, as part of their interviewing process. You can do a simulation of work. You cannot do real work. If it actually benefits the organization, you cannot have them do that to prove their ability. They can do a simulation. I love simulations. Real work, you got to pay them.
Let's take the bias the other way, and let's talk about so I don't know that we answered the previous question. I want to, now I want to change it a little.
Okay.
What are three things that you would say interviewers need to know, that they're probably using unconscious bias about? That sentence really didn't come out right, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah,
Like,
well, we are, and we covered a little bit.
okay.
If you're sorting applications based on
No, I
some
mean
of the
already
things
in
that are
the
on,
interview
okay, they're
process.
already
They're already
in the
in
interview
the interview
process.
process.
They are in the interview process. They are doing things, and we've talked about this. You and I have different opinions on this, and that is handshake, right? They're making decisions about things that have nothing to do with the actual job. Handshake happens to be one of those things. I know you like it. It's a good thing we disagree on some things. Otherwise, it would just be
It's
boring to
okay.
talk, right?
It's okay.
I think we do that. We trying to think of that happens within the actual interview process. One, oh, well, we're waiting for everybody else to get in the room. P.S. Let's just be ready. If the interview's at 10, let's have everybody ready and collected wherever we're going to interview. We would not have our most important client waiting at 10 o'clock. And then at 10:15, we finally pull them into the interview. So as we're trying to collect everybody else to come into the interview, who's ever in the room with that candidate starts making small talk. And that small talk is still part of the interview of record. And so we'll ask things there like, oh, so do you have kids? And now it's made a bias that overlooks everything, because even if I'm doing it in a chit chat way and not in a nefarious way, the reality is if I say 7 kids, you're thinking, oh, I'm calculating how many days off she's going to take. Right. So be very cognizant of the chit chat interview that happens at the very beginning when we're not prepared. The same thing happens. Somebody walks in with crutches and we say, oh, what happened? None of your business. You don't want to know. You do not want to know, because now you may have gone into ADA situations, so you don't want to know. So that one definitely does it. We make notes on people's resumes and applications about what they're wearing, how tall they are, what gender they are, to try to remember that candidate. You have to write down things that have to do with their experience. Those notes get discovered, and they will. If you do get legal action around your employment processes, that's no good. And the last one is, I really want you to do your own internal study on, okay, we brought in 5 candidates for this job. 2 of them were women, 3 of them were men. How many did we move to the next process? And I want you to keep track of those stats over time, because if you find that you continue to move the male candidates forward and not the female candidates forward, you have a disparate impact somewhere in your hiring process, in your interview questions, and how we're sorting through candidates. Because if we're bringing in equally qualified people and only the men are moving to the next advance, there's a question we're asking, there's something how we're handling their background checks, or how we're handling how we move them forward, that is giving a nod to the men. And if we can know that and track it, we can find it. And sometimes it shows up in the most simple ways. We didn't tell them that we were going to give them a site tour when they first were signed up for the interview. Making sure people know what's going to all take place during that interview. So you didn't tell them you're going to do a site tour. Now you're doing a site tour and I'm wearing 2-inch heels. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be uncomfortable. And you're going to feel that I wasn't prepared, except I was coming for an interview in an office. I wasn't coming for a job site. And so making sure people know in advance those types of things gives it away.
So, one thing that I'm thinking about is, at the end, when I told you the other guy and I, we would do this thumbs up, thumbs down, right? And I'm thinking about right now how that could be another way that could be more effective, because I think a lot of times at the end, teams look at each other and they're like, what'd you think? And the answer tends to be, I like him, I don't like him, I like her, I don't like her, like, I don't think she's a good fit, I don't think she fits our culture, I don't fit. Like, and maybe instead, the first question, once the applicant has left the building, is, what do you think would be the biggest competency they would bring to this role? So immediately make it about their experience or their competency, instead of about, do they fit the culture? Do they fit, whatever else it was that I said, because my brain just went off on another thing about culture too. Because one thing I learned, particularly at my last company, I found this surprising is we try and find people that fit our culture, but that's kind of the opposite of diversity, right? Like if the last company I worked at had a really fun culture, but we really lacked diversity in all aspects. I was the only woman on the female executive team. I was the only one that wasn't married. I was the only one without kids. Everyone was between a 8-year age difference. Like there was no
Mm-hmm.
diversity, and the company resonated that. Um, and I think
Yeah.
I think that we have to not think about culture and think about the competencies and the experience they bring. What would they bring to this company that we don't have yet? Or what would they bring to the role that we really need them to bring?
I think most of the time when people say, oh, they're not a cultural fit, they mean they don't look like me, talk like me, act like me, or believe like me. And we are simply ruling them out because they don't fit our demographics, which is exactly the opposite of diversity. Now, if we say they're not a values fit because we have a very strong ethical value or we have a very strong anything like that, that's a different thing. And they've just given you a story about how they circumvented a rule and that kind of a thing. And you're like, ooh, like we don't do that here. Um, that's a different element. But for the most part, when people say, oh, they're not really a cultural fit, they don't want to go get a beer afterwards, or they don't want to, after work, or they don't want to, participate in the bowling league, or they don't want to whatever. And that might have to do with all kinds of protected things, and they don't have to do those things to be a good fit for us as an employee. I
Yeah.
think there's a shift that's taking place right now, especially in this post-pandemic era where not everyone's coming back into office roles, where we're getting this division of those that are working there and those that aren't, which is a whole nother element that's happening. But we're having all generations have a deeper appreciation for the fact that I should only be paid for the hours. I should only have to work the hours that I'm paid for. And that it is not a reasonable expectation to have me be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that is happening as people are working from home and no longer have the drive from the office to the house that segments it. So that means I need to
Mhm.
be able to turn my phone off. I need to be able to turn my computer off. I need to be able to turn work off. And for years, that has not been kind of a corporate norm. And so we're getting more and more pushback on that. So to say, well, they think it's unreasonable that I can't that I should be able to call them at 11 p.m. at night, and they don't think that that's reasonable. So that's a cultural fit. You're going to find that more and more. Like more and more people are pushing back and saying, yeah, we need to segment my work life and my life a little bit better.
Well, and that makes me think of another comment that I've heard multiple times and not quoted exactly like this, but I don't know that she has the personality to succeed here or the personality to make it here, whatever. And I think you have to step back and say, what does that actually mean? Is there something wrong with our culture
Yeah, yeah.
that you have to be that strong to make it here? Or are we not thinking about who can we pair them with to build up that side? Because a lot of times I think the the inner strength comes from what appears to be a lack of confidence, and sometimes women show a lack of confidence in a way that people think is lacking confidence, and it's not. I mean, the definition of confidence says nothing about what someone looks like or what their mannerisms are. It's all about an internal feeling. And so the way that a woman displays confidence versus the way that a man displays it can be very different. But no matter who the candidate is, if they don't appear strong enough to work in the environment, do they have all the other skills? Let's set the culture aside right now and
Yeah.
it may need to be fixed, right? But do they
Yeah.
have all the skills? And okay, you know what? I've got to think about this. If I can put that person with Andy, Andy will be really good at building their confidence and creating that for them, and while they're developing the other technical skills that they don't have yet. Thinking about where you can partner them to develop something in them and not just trying to get this package that's already put together and fits like a little cube in the culture that you have.
I think I think that's very insightful. And how do we develop somebody in our organization? I also think the words I wrote down is that they appear to not have. And we, again, appear to not have is a big storyline. And so have we asked them about a time when like stuff happens? You're going to have a disagreement. Like we talk about this conflict thing, but I think of when you and another colleague have differing opinions on how you're going to move forward on a project. Can you tell us about how you've navigated it and how you've worked it through, right? Or is it just, I just let them have their way or not? I think of immediately having worked in warehousing and trucking, third-party logistics, right? Like, yeah, I remember when I knew that we needed to put a rail line, we needed to put a barrier up for our rail depot, and there wasn't one. There was a huge unprotected pit. If I'd come storming in and said, well, it's OSHA reg, blah, 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 they would have just tuned me out. And instead, I approached it in terms of, have we ever had an accident? Have we had any close calls here? Like, how big of a deal do you think that would be, right? And drawing on their knowledge and their experience and coming to a collaborative solution. But can somebody give example of times when they've had that disagreement? They know they're going to go up against somebody who has a different point of view or who isn't going to prioritize an object. They're not going to prioritize a project that you know needs to be prioritized versus they seem pretty meek. They seem pretty quiet.
I think that's really important. And I think maybe we end on that because the crux of that, the cliff notes of that is if you're interviewing someone and you're thinking to yourself, I don't think they're very confident. I don't think they're very this. They don't appear they're very this. They don't seem this. Recognize that you are thinking, seem, appear. You don't know yet because you haven't asked. You need to come up with a question that will allow you to ask them and allow them to answer in a way that helps to provide clarity to what they appear or seem to be like. I love that.
Yeah, you need to explore it. If you catch yourself saying it doesn't seem like they appear, it doesn't seem like they have that, it appears that they don't, explore it, find out.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised. I mean, years ago, we would say, oh, a woman she didn't appear that she could lift 100 pounds. We didn't actually test it, right? Now we test it. Because there's men who can't, and there's women who can.
That's
and
right.
There's an introvert who can, and there's an extrovert who can't. And so how they're showing up in that interview might not tell you the whole story.
Absolutely. And they may be someone who's just not good at interviewing. It makes them uncomfortable and they are a rock star at their daily job, right? There's things like that you have to evaluate, but once again, you're thinking, okay, this is probably just they're uncomfortable at the interview. Ask questions to get them to answer and give you that feedback. Okay, so I have loved this. I love that we made it a 2-part series. So everybody, this is just a taste of what you're going to get from Nora in her new podcast that's releasing very soon called Stories from the Break Room. And now that she's showing her podcast label, but now that you have heard Nora, you know some of the stories she's going to come back with. And I always love hearing her stories. Sometimes they are just literally jaw-dropping. And other times they're like, oh shit, I've actually done that. I need to learn from it. So I can't wait for your podcast to come out. It's going to be fantastic. I will be listening. I will subscribe. Thank you for agreeing to be on mine.
Of course.
If you know someone that could benefit from this particular episode, then share it with them. Or if you want to continue to learn about the untapped and underutilized resources that will take your business to the next level, then follow the podcast. You don't want to miss an episode where we discuss what you needed to hear. And lastly, there is a link in the show notes that will allow you to reach out to me directly if you want to accelerate that learning curve. Thanks for listening. Talk soon.